In the past decade, taxes as a share of GDP have risen, and unless the country chooses unpalatable spending cuts, they will almost certainly keep rising. UK public services are in crisis, with a healthcare system struggling with much longer waiting lists, and this is despite actually receiving more money. Less prominent departments like education, prisons and courts have seen significant cuts in real spending. Yet the true trade-offs and difficult decisions are being hidden from view. Rishi Sunak recently claimed that Labour will raise taxes £2,000. But according to analysis by The Spectator, the government's own taxes will go up by £3,000 in the coming year. But the larger question is it such a bad thing if taxes go up? Which is more important, tax cuts or public services which work? What is the real trade-off? What are the real decisions we need to make? In the post-war period, real GDP per capita increased by over 500%, and we got used to the idea of rising living standards and better opportunities than our parents. "You've never had it so good," boasted Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. Poverty and inequality declined, and the memories of the Great Depression faded from view. In the 1960s, defence spending was still a bigger share of GDP than healthcare, but the peace dividend and the end of national service saw it decline quite sharply, and this enabled a seamless rise in healthcare. We could swap guns for butter and hospital beds. Not only was there this peace dividend, but economic growth gave the government more tax revenue without having to increase tax rates. The problem is that this golden period has come stuttering to an end. In the past 15 years, economic growth has fallen off a cliff. Rather than growing at 2.5% a year, real GDP per capita has barely increased, less than 0.5% a year. Living standards are still lower than pre-COVID, and this has given the government a real financial headache. Tax revenues have stopped growing, and the past 14 years have seen austerity and spending cuts, leading to many departments struggling. Local councils have seen a 40% decline in central funding. No wonder many councils are going bust. The other elephant in the room is that the UK population is ageing, but the worst is still yet to come. The population is going to get even older. Now, perhaps because they're more likely to vote, pensioners have often become a target of government promises. First we had the pension double lock, then the triple lock, and now something of a convoluted quadruple lock. By international standards, UK pensions are not particularly generous. The UK spends just 5% of GDP on pensions, compared to a massive 16% in Italy. But this is going to change over the coming years, and it's not just pensions but related healthcare. Since 2016, there's been a 10% rise in requests for long-term social care, but a 4% fall in the actual provision. And this trend is only going to get worse. There's going to be increasing demand for social care and healthcare. And at the same time, there's a huge shortage of social care workers, 10% vacancy rate. In the past 15 years, median real incomes of pensioners has increased by 9%. Not particularly impressive. But non-pension income have increased by even less, just 5.5% since 2009. Whilst pensions have risen in real terms, benefits for working age people have been cut or frozen. And this is a hidden cost that receives little media attention. For example, the fact that child poverty rates have started to increase again. In 1981, the UK had the 11th most generous welfare state. This has now decreased to be the 16th generous welfare state. But the impact of freezing or cutting benefits receives very little attention. A good example is the freezing of local housing benefits. In 2009, housing benefits were capped at 50% of average rent. It meant that people could afford a small or reasonable choice of accommodation. But now, local housing benefits have been capped at just 30% of average rents, which means that for many people, there are literally no choices of places to rent. And with a decline in social housing, it means that many people are in a tremendously difficult situation. And this explains why the UK has seen such a sharp rise in homelessness. The UK is one of the worst homelessness rates in the world. And this stems from austerity, spending cuts, which later proved to be a false economy, because we have to pay for the fact that people can't afford housing. And this rise in homelessness itself has a high cost to the taxpayer. Local authorities are spending a higher percentage of their limited revenue on paying for temporary accommodation. Councils warn that the cost of temporary accommodation is crippling their finances and forcing many into bankruptcy. The Guardian recently reported how Eastbourne Council said that in its borough they were spending 49p in every pound that they collected on temporary accommodation. It's a crazy situation. Now, the long-term solution is building social housing, but in the short term, increasing housing benefits to previous levels would help cap the rise in homelessness and the costs and social consequences. Yet there's very little awareness of the trade-offs that we face. Cutting benefits seems a way to save money, but in the long term, it causes costs to the government and the rest of society. Another very tricky issue is immigration. All the main parties talk about cutting immigration levels, and it's almost certainly going to fall in the coming years from its very high level last year. But what are the costs, or trade-offs at least, of net zero immigration? Smaller population growth would put less upward pressure on rents, which would be perhaps a benefit. But on the other hand, say cutting foreign student visas would increase the cost of education for domestic students, because foreign students effectively subsidise universities. Cutting work visas would improve net migration figures, but it would exacerbate the shortage of workers in key areas like healthcare and social care. Around 19% of the NHS is staff born outside the country, and social care is even higher. If we cut immigration, then these vacancy rates and the costs associated with that will increase. The big question is, what would people prefer? Would they prefer higher pensions and low tax, or more spending on healthcare and getting shorter waiting lists? Waiting lists in the UK have recently hit 7.4 million and are forecast to fall only very slowly. Would pensioners, the biggest consumers of healthcare, be better served with lower income tax rates or better healthcare? Evidence suggests the electorate is split. 36% of voters would support higher spending even if it meant higher taxes. 33% prefer lower tax even if it means lower spending. Now, response rates to this kind of a question depend very much on framing. But how many would support the idea of paying more tax to be able to see a doctor? At the very least, it's an interesting trade-off, it's an interesting question. But the media landscape is dominated by tax cuts are good, any kind of tax rise are bad. The problem is that public services are in a worse state than many realise. Departments like prisons, justice and environment and education have all seen real cuts in the past decade, leading to longer waiting times and overcrowding. And the government budget for the coming years is premised on big real spending cuts to come on top of all this former austerity. The OBR referred to government plans as a fiscal fiction, with no detail about how these spending cuts will be achieved. Not only that, but there's more bad news. Future spending plans are premised on quite high levels of productivity growth, around 1.5%. But this is overly optimistic, given the past trends of the past 15 years. Very soon, the OBR will almost inevitably have to reduce their optimistic forecasts to be something more realistic. This means lower tax revenue and an even bigger fiscal hole. The truth is, the next government will have to raise taxes and or cut spending just to stand still. If you actually want to improve public services and invest in energy and housing, it would require either higher borrowing and or higher taxes. And this is the uncomfortable trade-off that we face. But it doesn't help to put your head in the sand and pretend it's not there. Everything has an opportunity cost. Cutting taxes means lower spending and lower services. Lower immigration means fewer workers for an economy that has a declining workforce. Cutting house building and housing benefit has created homelessness and bankrupted local councils. Promises to cut taxes will have an impact of lower spending in the future. We could go on, but the point is, what is the trade-off and what kind of society do we want to focus on? Now, if you don't like all these unpalatable trade-offs, is there any alternative to boost future economic growth? It is actually quite difficult, but this video looks into more detail about how it could actually be done.